What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. We're taking a look at Diablo 4's closed beta running on the Steam Deck here for SteamOS and Windows 11. But to get this running on SteamOS, I am of course using the Battle.net launcher as a non-Steam game, but you also need to force Proton GE Layer 27. So if you haven't already installed that from desktop mode, you'll want to do that. And as of right now anyway, it's the only way to really get the game to launch, and shout out to Steam Deck Gaming who turned me on to that. Now settings wise, we're 800p full screen here with no FSR currently on, and medium for textures, and everything else down through here will either be low or turned off, except for clutter. I didn't turn that off here, I left it on low. So we'll pretty much stick with that for now as we get into it. And as is typical for a lot of newer games that release, the beginning of the game gives you some hope and runs pretty well, and a lot of times will be around 60 FPS with the occasional FPS dip or stutter, and frame times are pretty decent. So at first things look pretty good, whether you're outside or if you jump inside to some combat as well. Of course inside was even easier to hold 60 FPS a lot of the time, but that's really just for the beginning of the game. Once you get past the kind of intro and into the first town, whether you're on SteamOS or Windows, that's when things will change. So this is my last battle right outside of the town where things are still running pretty decently and still getting around that 60 FPS. But as we get into it and we jump into the town, that's when performance is going to kind of get all over the place, and anywhere from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, it just kind of varies. And there's a lot of NPCs and a lot more going on in the town than outside, so I wasn't necessarily surprised by that. But it also happens once we get out of town as well, and we'll take a look at that. So if we jump out of town and get into some combat, we're still past that initial area. The FPS is more all over the place as you might expect, so it doesn't hold the way the first part of the game does. And so that kind of tells you, depending on where you're at in this game, it's going to depend on how it runs. Now, this is just the beta, so how the actual game runs at launch is going to be something different to look at. And that's when I'll dive in a lot deeper, looking at more settings, more frame rates, and how to get the game to run even better. And I think it'll be more worth it. But just for the closed beta, I think just taking a look here like this is enough to kind of see what the performance is doing. Now, jumping over to Windows 11 here, I am running the exact same settings, except I've turned FSR on to begin with, just to kind of check it out, and I'll turn it off a little bit later, but we'll get into it here. Other than that, all the settings are the exact same as I had over on SteamOS. And for the most part, the beginning of the game pretty much gives you the same hope that it gives you there, where your frame rates and whatnot are pretty good, but I suffer more big dips and stutters on Windows, even in the beginning of the game, than I do over on SteamOS. And SteamOS has a newer driver than Windows does, and so it might not be that surprising that it runs a little better anyway, even on that older Proton 27 layer. I do hope we see some updates from Valve when it comes to the Windows side of the GPU driver. But getting back over here into that same town, the performance is very much like SteamOS, of course, maybe with worse frame times and dips. Now I'll go ahead and turn FSR off just to see how things are here, and it's pretty much going to be the same type of performance. And again, that's kind of what I found out with all of my time here. It took me about 8 hours of working on this video because of the extremely long queue times we had. I had to keep waiting 1 to 2 hours to get back into the game and to test the different operating systems. But you can see here, things just aren't as clean for Windows. And I hope that in the future, even though Valve doesn't necessarily have a lot of incentive to, that they'll give us a newer GPU driver that I think could help us out a bit. Also, with the game's release, getting a little bit more optimization, and over on the SteamOS side, a newer version of Proton that maybe could handle things a little better as well. Now I did go ahead and give some 30 FPS cap a shot here on SteamOS just to see what it was like, and ultimately I still get those huge dips down to the teens and back up at different load-in areas, and sometimes during combat it will smooth out from time to time, but it kind of smooths out in the same areas that 60 FPS would smooth out for me, or 55 FPS, so it's not necessarily a resource or overhead thing. It's not necessarily an FSR thing that will help, or a frame rate cap. We just need the game to be able to run better, whether it be the drivers, the game optimization, or Proton layers, or whatever it happens to be for each OS. Now the total amount of RAM as well for the system, whether I'm on Windows or SteamOS, can certainly go over what would be the 16 gigs in the system. Now sometimes VRAM just gets allocated without necessarily being used, and sometimes it's actually being used up by the GPU. But if we really were overusing that much and writing to the SSD, that could be a major problem as well. But it's hard to tell. I did also test with textures turned all the way down instead of medium and on low, and some other things with clutter turned off, just whatever I could do, and I could not increase performance in any way with the beta from what I'm showing here. But anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video and kind of got an idea of how the Diablo 4 closed beta is running on the Steam Deck for both SteamOS and Windows 11. And as always, I appreciate you guys coming to watch, and I'll see you in the next one.